Order, order. Mr Talamajid Singh Desi to move the motion.
Sir Edward, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I beg to move that this House has considered imprisonment for public protection. Sentences of imprisonment for public protection, IPP sentences, are an often overlooked part of our criminal justice system, despite the huge impact they have on those prisoners who are continuing to serve them. They were intended to protect the public from serious offenders and ensure that dangerous, violent and sexual offenders stayed in custody for as long as they presented a risk to society. Under the IPP regime, offenders granted an IPP were set a minimum term that they must spend in prison, but unlike most other sentences, there was no upper limit, meaning that once the minimum tariff was served, they must then apply to the parole board for release. Only if the parole board is satisfied that they were not a danger to the public can someone serving an IPP sentence be released. Release is therefore not automatic, and if the parole board are not satisfied that someone serving an IPP sentence has demonstrated that they no longer pose a risk, the prisoner can remain in custody indefinitely. Sir Edward, I have discussed these concerns with colleagues, including the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, my honourable friend, the member for Leeds East, who too realises the gravity of this important issue and how it impacts on so many families, and hence why I applied for the matter to be debated amongst honourable and right honourable members in Parliament. Yes.
Thank you very much for allowing me to intervene. The point that he's just made is a very important one. This has a big impact on families, and I don't think that we should lose sight of that as we go through this debate. The other point about it is that the number of prisoners who commit self-harm during this is much higher than across the rest of the prison population. So does he think that these two factors should play a part in his thinking?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and with great eloquence he has highlighted two of the key issues as to why this debate is so important, and I concur fully with his views. In many cases, Sir Edward, IPP sentences that had shorter tariffs of less than 2 years have become in effect a life sentence, as people have been stuck in limbo, unable to prove that they no longer pose a risk, often for reasons beyond their control. For those IPP sentenced prisoners, the sentences did not work as intended and instead have become an unfairly punitive aspect of our criminal justice system. It is on those prisoners that I would like to focus my remarks today, as it is those on the shortest tariffs that have experienced the injustice. So, Sir Edward, why were IPP sentenced abolished in the first place? Whilst designed to protect the public from serious offenders, the reality is that IPP sentences were handed down for a far broader range of offences than was intended. They were handed down at a rate of more than 800 per year, moving thousands of people into prison indefinitely. This led to offenders who had committed more minor crimes facing a short tariff but an indefinite sentence. The Prison Reform Trust late last year published a report which found that over half of prisoners still serving an IPP had a tariff of 4 years or less, and 15% had a tariff of less than 2 years. Custody and imprisonment should be used as a last resort, and indefinite custody with no fixed end should only be used for where a very serious offence has been committed. I fully appreciate there are cases where individuals have committed heinous crimes against humanity, and therefore the local community is extremely concerned about prisoners' release. One such case was highlighted to me by the Brexit Minister, the Honourable Member for Worcester, wherein he and his predecessor had both worked with the local community to highlight their very serious concerns about someone who had killed and impaled 3 children onto railings after murdering them in their home. However, what I am most concerned about are those non-serious cases wherein someone is sentenced to a short sentence and ends up being imprisoned for years on end. Where people are safe to be released, we should not be keeping them in custody to serve many multiples of their tariff for the crimes that they have committed. It stands against the principles of natural justice on which our justice system is founded. The more widespread use of IPPs than was intended has also led to a number of instances where offenders committing the same offence in the same context, were handed sentences where one offender could be expected to spend a lot longer in prison. Even the author of IPP sentences, Sir Edward, David Blunkett, acknowledges that this was a flawed policy. Lord Blunkett noted, and I quote, "The consequence of bringing that act in has led, in some cases, to an injustice, and I regret that." In 2012, the government rightly took the decision to abolish sentences of imprisonment for public protection for offenders, meaning that it was no longer an option available to judges. However, whilst it was the right decision, the issue remains of what to do to address those who are currently serving an IPP sentence. Yes.
Grateful for my friend for giving way. He's right in recognising that these sentences have now been abolished, and the Parole Board previously aimed to get the IPP prisoner population below 1,500 by 2020, but latest figures show that the number of people still serving these IPP sentences is above 2,400. So given these sentences have actually abolished, does my honourable friend agree that actually those that continue to serve under these sentences should actually be resentenced under the rules that exist at the moment?
I thank my honourable friend, and I think with great telepathy, I too will be referring to the Parole Board and the statistic that she has very ably highlighted, and I fully agree with her. Sir Edward, that is the issue that the government, the current government, has to grapple with, and the problem remains a real one for the prisoners, for their families, for the justice system, and for wider society that needs to have confidence in a justice system that rehabilitates and is fair and proportionate. Let's examine the continued use of IPP sentences. On the 31st of March 2019, as my honourable friend for Lewisham Western Pendja has highlighted, there were 2,403 prisoners still serving an IPP sentence who were yet to be released, despite the abolition of the sentence over 7 years ago. Of these, 9 out of 10 have already served their minimum tariff that was handed down to them by the judge at their trial. A large proportion of those still serving an IPP sentence, after surpassing their original tariff, were initially sent to prison to serve a short tariff. Of the close to 400 people on an IPP sentence with a tariff of less than 2 years, over half have served 9 years or more beyond their original tariff, which is a travesty, I feel. And my honourable friend, the member for Stretford and Urmston, who can't be here today, has also informed me that a recent parliamentary question she tabled revealed that there are currently 46 women on IPP sentences, yet the Ministry of Justice does not know how many of these women have children. Given that this is such a low number and the impact of mothers' imprisonment on children is well documented, I believe that that is a shocking admission. And the Parole Board predicts that unless changes are made to the situation faced by the IPP prisoners, there will still be 1,500 people in prison serving an IPP sentence by 2020. And to illustrate, Sir Edward, the issues faced by people still serving IPP sentences, I want to draw attention to some particularly tragic examples of the effect that the indefinite nature of IPP sentences can have on those prisoners sentenced to them. Yes.
I'm very grateful. Just before he goes on to highlight his examples, I raised the case of my constituent Wayne Bell, who has had a mental health crisis and is now unable to engage with the parole process. And given that there was a study a few years ago that said that 1 in 10 IPP prisoners were seeking psychiatric help in prison, double the rate for the normal prison population, does he share my concern that prisoners can easily get into a downward spiral where they have a mental health crisis, they're not able to engage with the parole process, it makes them more depressed, and there's no way out of that sort of downward spiral for them, and there's no way of them being able to resolve their situations?
I thank my honourable friend, Sir Edward, for his excellent intervention. And indeed, he has encapsulated the issue at hand in terms of mental health issues and the intertwined nature of what we are actually discussing. And I will elaborate further on the mental health problems faced by prisoners. But let me highlight, first of all, the case of Tommy Nicol. In 2009, Tommy Nicol received an IPP sentence with a minimum 4-year tariff for stealing a car from a mechanic's garage and injuring a man's arm in the process. Once his tariff was completed, the parole board refused his request to be released and told him he should access a therapeutic community in order to address his mental health issues and become safe to be released. Tommy's mental health suffered as he was repeatedly denied access to mental health treatment courses. He was moved to prisons which did not even offer those courses, proving that he had been rehabilitated increasingly difficult. In November 2014, he made a formal complaint saying that IPP sentences were a form of psychological torture. And around this time, he also began to self-segregate and went on hunger strike. His behaviour became increasingly erratic as he understandably struggled to deal with the psychological impact of his situation. Tommy, tragically, Sir Edward, took his own life in prison in September 2015. And let's also examine the case of James Ward, who was given an IPP sentence in 2006 with a tariff of 1 year, only 1 year, for setting light to his mattress while in prison, serving a fixed sentence for a fight with his father. He ended up serving not 1 year, but serving 11 years.
On that point,
Yes.
for giving way, does he agree with me that the case of arsonists is often serious in this IPP sentence structure? Because of the links between arson and sex offending and reckless behaviour, they have been disproportionately affected by this.
I thank my honourable friend, and she has very ably made that point with respect to how arsonists end up serving a lot longer than they should, and it just is not fair in terms of the fairness within the system. That is not there. And in that time, in terms of James Ward, he regularly self-harmed and his mental health deteriorated significantly. He has since spoken out about the damage the IPP sentence did to his mental health, telling the Today programme, and I quote, "Prison is not fit to accommodate people like me with mental health problems. It's made me worse. How can I change in a place like this? I wake up every morning scared of what the day may hold." And let's also delve into the impact of IPP sentences on prisoners, of people stuck in limbo with a lack of access to courses and treatments. These cases show how much more needs to be done to address the issue faced by those serving IPP sentences. They also highlight a particular issue of IPP sentenced prisoners not being able to complete the courses that the parole board has told them that will help demonstrate that they are safe for release. Partly this is because we face an increasingly violent and overcrowded prison system where there are simply not enough places on the relevant courses and therefore not enough opportunities for short tariff IPP sentenced prisoners to demonstrate that they no longer pose risk. But there are also other problems which are easier to fix. For example, the families of IPP sentenced prisoners have said that prisoners are prioritised for places on courses based on how close they are to their release date. Because IPP sentenced prisoners do not have a fixed release date, they therefore fall to the back of the queue and can struggle to ever get on the appropriate courses. In his reply, I would be very grateful if the Minister could provide an update today on what is being done to address this particular issue. And Sir Edward, if we look at mental health problems, which many of my honourable colleagues have highlighted, IPP sentences have a huge impact on prisoners, as they would do on anyone who is locked up and deprived of their liberty with no end in sight. They create a sense of despair and a feeling of hopelessness, which can have a significant impact on an individual's mental health, demonstrated by the fact that IPP prisoners are significantly more likely to self-harm than determinate sentence prisoners, and even more than life sentence prisoners, which is an amazing statistic. This is borne out by the numerous reports, such as those by the Prison Reform Trust, the Sainsbury Centre for Mental Health, the Howard League for Penal Reform, and the Institute for Criminal Policy Research at King's College London. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons found that IPP prisoners were significantly more likely than life or determinate sentence prisoners to have arrived in their current prison with problems, including feeling depressed and suicidal. Mental health issues are already endemic in our prison system, with at least 1 in 3 prisoners reported to have mental health issues by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons reports, and a much greater figure more likely in reality. And instances of self-harm are already too high, with 55,598 instances in 2018 alone. We need to see a comprehensive and fully funded strategy for the reduction of all forms of violence in prison, including self-harm, and that must include special support for those on IPP sentences. Could the Minister specifically outline today what special provision is made for tackling mental health conditions of IPP prisoners, especially those with shorter tariffs, but who have served way beyond it and so who probably never expected to be in this situation? Sir Edward, another issue that affects the prisoners' ability to rehabilitate and turn their life around is recall. When an IPP sentenced prisoner is released, they are released on licence with strict licence conditions that must be followed. Breaching these conditions can result in recall to prison. In many cases, this is a correct and appropriate response, but there are cases where technical breaches, for example, missing a probation meeting because of unforeseen illness or travel delays, has resulted in recall to prison. The excessive use of recalls to prisons for minor breaches of licence has contributed to the number of IPP prisoners remaining in prison staying stubbornly high. Families of those serving IPP sentences have called for a more reasonable approach to recalls to be taken to ensure that only those breaches which suggest someone poses a risk should necessitate the deprivation of an individual's liberty. Minor breaches of licensing conditions are often not crimes in of themselves, but simple things like missing appointments and breaching administrative conditions. The ex-head of the parole board told of offenders sent back to prison for turning up drunk at their bail hostel, even though that presented no risk to anybody. And repeated recall to prison whilst on release on licence also prevents an IPP prisoner from securing housing and holding down a job, both of which are factors which are proven to reduce reoffending rates. And indeed, 936 people on IPP sentences were released by the parole board in 2017. In the same year, 543 people on IPPs were recalled. This is a complex and serious issue that will only be tackled, Sir Edward, with proper coordination between the Ministry of Justice, prisons, probation and the police. So could the Minister please outline what is his government strategy to tackle the issue about recall? The only way that an IPP prisoner can be finally entirely released from an IPP sentence is to apply to the parole board 10 years after their release from custody to have their licence ended. And many experts and campaigners have rightly pointed out that they believe that this is simply too long and sets people up to fail. Does the Minister have plans to amend this? And before concluding, I want to highlight, Sir Edward, the impact of IPP sentences on our justice system. IPP sentences don't just have a detrimental impact on the mental health and stability of offenders, both whilst in prison and during release on their extraordinarily long licences. They're also detrimental to the efficient running of the prison and parole system. The parole board has historically heard the cases of offenders convicted of longer sentences than those who were subject to IPP sentences, but are now forced to conduct a lengthy risk assessment process for short tariff offenders on IPP sentences. There is also no doubt that the rapid increase in the number of those on IPPs contributed to prison overcrowding, and that it still continues despite the abolition of IPP sentences because of the difficulties many IPP sentenced prisoners have in demonstrating they are safe to be released. The prison population has risen significantly since 1994 and then again since 2000 following changes to minimum sentences, and the UK, Sir Edward, now has the highest imprisonment rate in Western Europe. with 141 prisoners per 100,000 of the population. Our prisons are also often dangerously overcrowded, with many prisons operating at significantly over their certified capacity. This overcrowding has a detrimental impact on safety, which has fallen considerably under this government, with prisons substantially more violent now than in the past, and also on the ability of prisons to effectively rehabilitate offenders, with overcrowding repeatedly raised as an area of concern by Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons due to its effect on what resources are available to reduce reoffending. Sir Edward, in conclusion, it is now time for IPP sentences to be resolved. There have been continued calls for further change, including from former Justice Secretaries, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons and the Chair of the Parole Board, which focus on the unfairness for prisoners still serving IPP sentences and on the challenges that it creates for the prison system. While abolishing the use of new IPP sentences was a correct course of action, there is still more to be done to address the issues faced by those who were sent to prison for a short tariff that is effectively now turned into a life sentence. The families of those on IPP sentences are themselves making proposals that may well offer a way forward. For example, Donna, the sister of Tommy Nichol, who I referred to earlier, is now campaigning for reforms to the system faced by IPP sentenced prisoners. She has called for those serving initial tariffs of 4 years or less, as her brother was, to have their sentences converted to fixed sentences. Is that something the Minister is looking at? There are many suggested ways of reforming these outlawed sentences, ensuring public safety and justice has been served. Some suggestions from the criminal justice reform sector include converting IPP sentences to fixed-length sentences, starting with the shorter tariffs, and protecting the public with minimum licence periods. The government, I think, needs to finish the job that it has started. The challenge now is for the government to lay out how it will ensure that this wrong is finally righted. Until it is, it will remain a stain on our justice system.
Questions this House has considered imprisonment for public protection. Now, I'm anxious to get all colleagues in, so could all colleagues keep an eye on the clock, please, and perhaps no more than 6 or 7 minutes, and I'll start by calling Victoria Prentice.
Thank you, Sir Edward, and thank you very much for calling me first in this debate. Owing to unavoidable complications at home, I am going to have to leave, and I apologise to both front benches that I won't be here for the summing up, but I will look forward to reading what they have to say. This is an issue on which I have very long campaigned, and I'm afraid I wouldn't have missed this debate for the world, and I'm so grateful to you for allowing me to take part. It is a great pleasure and honour to follow such an excellent speech from the Honourable Gentleman. He has said almost all that needs to be said, Sir Edward, so I don't think colleagues will have any difficulty in keeping to the time limit that you've suggested. He is right, and I thought he fairly said that both sides of this House have fault on this difficult issue. IPP prisoners and their families are victims of fairly catastrophically bad policy making in the first place. But then, when that was seen and when the system was changed in 2012, to my great delight, those of us who were then in power, not that I was at the time, or not directly, I was a civil servant working in this field, the residue were left. The changes were not made retrospective. And that means, as the Honourable Gentleman said, that the fate of these people is indeed a stain on our system. They are the victims of poor policy making, but they are also the victims of an enormous amount of churn in the Ministry of Justice. And it is, as ever, a great pleasure to see my dear friend, the Prisons Minister, in his place. I hope he is allowed to stay in his place for long enough to sort this out and several other matters, including children's criminal records, about which I will talk to him later. But I do think it is very important that we quickly get on with what the reforms that my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, the member for Surrey Heath, was positing with me when I asked him some fairly brusque questions on this issue in the Justice Select Committee in July 2016. He told me he was actively considering changing the release test and bringing about legislative change in order to help IPP prisoners. Unfortunately, he was moved on the following day. And that has been the picture of my attempts to get ministers to engage with this issue over the last 4 years. So I very much hope that we can hang on to the minister on the front bench for long enough to do something about it. The test for the release of IPPs is very high, and Dr. Harry Annison of Southampton Law School, when he gave evidence to the Justice Select Committee, said that IPP sentences were falling little short of life imprisonment. I am particularly concerned, as I said earlier, about those convicted of arson offences. We heard evidence of a man who was convicted for a minimum of 10 months in 2006 and not released for 11 years. I remember when I was in practice an extraordinary case of an individual who'd been convicted for setting fire to a pair of church curtains and was in prison very, very many years later. The reasons and the type of lifestyle which had led to the original offence really did not make him a continuing risk to society. We've already heard from the Honourable Gentleman, and I'm sure others will talk about the horrific despair and effect of not knowing when you're going to be released on individuals in prison. It is Kafkaesque. It is not acceptable in our criminal justice system at all. IPPs were used far more widely than was intended. They were often given to offenders who committed low-level crimes with very short tariffs of under 2 years. They were handed out at an extraordinary rate at the time that they were started. They proved very difficult to understand, and they left victims and families uncertain about how and when people would be released. They've also led to real inconsistencies in sentencing. The sentence created its own complexities that I think had not been fully foreseen at the time that it was conceived of. The test for release has been set at a very high threshold, and as a result, this has led to the real problems with mental health and suicide and self-harm, which I think the Honourable Gentleman has already gone into, so I won't. But there is good news. Since 2017, there has been a concerted effort by the Prison Service, the Probation Service and the Parole Board to progress cases. And in 2017 to 18, the Parole Board ordered the release of over 900 IPP prisoners, including the re-release of some of those who have been recalled. Now these, I know the Honourable Gentleman's already asked the Minister to go into recall in some detail, and I do think that's important, both across the prison service generally, but particularly with this cohort. There are real concerns about the way the recall system is being used with this cohort. There is a great deal more to do. There is immediate and action that could be taken without legislative change in terms of treatment programmes. Both the Parole Board and the prison psychologists have gone to enormous lengths to say that there are other options which demonstrate release other than treatment programmes. But it remains the case that boards are very influenced by programmes that have been undertaken by offenders. I'm concerned generally about treatment programmes and the way that we evaluate them. I'm concerned that we for many years held up the SOTP as a gold standard and then got rid of it overnight and brought in new systems because it was proved not to work. And I was interested by a recent FOI request from Transform Justice, which showed that 95% of accredited programmes have no impact evaluation. I am really worried about undue influence being placed by boards on programmes which have not been properly evaluated and which the lack of which, or the lack of provision of which, is effectively keeping people in prison. without real evidence that that's the right place for them to be. So, urgent action, please, Minister, on treatment programmes, urgent action on evaluating treatment programmes, and real direction on not over-putting reliance on programmes which have not been fully evaluated. There are various other, in the Prison Population Report 2022, which the Justice Select Committee published in March, and for which the government very kindly gave us its response yesterday, there is a great deal of common ground between the government and the Justice Select Committee. In there, and I'm sure my dear friend, the chairman of the Justice Select Committee, will go into this, there are very good practical suggestions from the Howard League and from the Parole Board itself on how to deal with IPP prisoners, and I would encourage the Minister to take all of that on board, but I have to say that I, and I know others on the Justice Select Committee, would go further. We think that the blight on our justice system of these prisoners is so bad that legislative change is the only way forward.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. For Slough for his contribution in commencing this debate today. I just want to say something at the very beginning, Sir Edward, which I hope members will take as a helpful contribution, that all of those people who are in prison under an IPP sentence were there because at some point they've committed a crime and have hurt a victim. And we shouldn't forget that in our debate here today, because there are many people who are in prison for offences which have been serious, which have been dangerous, and which have caused great harm to people in the community. The question we are talking about today is how do we ensure we get a balance between punishment to those individuals for that offence, but also a helpful pathway to rehabilitation. And the IPP sentence, when it was introduced originally, was determined to be a sentence which gave a minimum term, but which then gave a series of conditions to say that the risk of an individual who's committed an offence poses to society has to be assessed in order for them to reach a standard which will allow them to be released back into the community. And as... certainly, yeah.
Thank you, Member, for giving way, and I'm glad he is zoned in on these two central pillars of what should be our justice system. Would you agree with me in the second pillar, which you talked about, of rehabilitation? Wider society needs to see that as a way, one way, to help reduce the risk of reoffending, and then people have more and more confidence in the justice system.
Absolutely. I think it's a key point that the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend in this case, I will still call him, makes today. But the key thing, Sir Edward, that I wanted to raise is that the problem that's been around with IPP prisoners is that the minimum tariffs have been passed, and that there have been, for many individuals, and we've had the figures to date, some 2,400 prisoners currently serving over-tariff IPP sentences, and now, because of where we are in the timeline, severely over-tariff IPP sentences. Those individuals, we need to find a pathway to ensure that they can reach some clarity and some conclusion after they've had their minimum term, which has paid their penalty back to society, but also how do we have some clarity about their rehabilitation and ultimate release.
Very good. The right honourable gentleman speaks with his characteristic eloquence. Kevin Willis, a constituent of mine, has served 13 years in custody, the equivalent of a 26-year determinate sentence, after being sentenced to an IPP with a 4-year tariff. Now, as the right honourable gentleman indicated, Kevin Willis committed a serious crime and deserved to go to prison. But does the right honourable gentleman agree with me that this kind of legal limbo, when he has no idea if and when he will be released, is unconscionable? And members of the public will find it hard to understand why some people only serve half their sentence that is announced on the steps of court, but others seem to serve many multiples of that sentence, and that is another problem with faith in the justice system.
I agree with the honourable gentleman in the sense that we have to assess the risk an individual faces and potentially causes society. We have a minimum term. People have passed that minimum term. We now have an element of indeterminate sentence where risk is assessed and release happens when that risk is deemed to be sufficient for release back into society. Now, the points I wish to make, Sir Edward, are really as follows. Of the 2,400 prisoners serving IPPs, including the 43 women who currently serve in prison. I'd like to know from the Minister what assessment is made of their potential risk now, because the reasons that they're still in prison now is because either they've been moved from prison to prison and not tracked effectively, either they've not had the courses made available to help with their rehabilitation, either they have posed risks because of the deterioration, as my honourable friend mentioned, of mental health or other issues whilst in prison. And the key point from today's debate that I want from the Minister is what assessment has he made and how can he prove the pathways for each of those individuals? Because it seems to me, Sir Edward, there are 3 clear pathways left for individuals with IPP sentences. Either we have a rehabilitation pathway that says these individuals need to complete these courses in order to reach a stage where the parole board can assess them to be a low-risk society and therefore eligible for release. Or if there's not a rehabilitation pathway, then we might need to look at whether there's a resentencing, so there's some definitive end date for that sentence, that the crime is such that whatever current pathways are operational through rehabilitation, an end date needs to be reassessed and given, which might be some years hence or may take into account time currently served. But what we need for every individual of those 2,400 is clarity on what that sentence is ultimately going to mean. Now, we've produced in the Justice Committee a report which indicates that we want to see that. And we've said, Sir Edward, we would like to see legislative solutions for both release and recall of indeterminate and sentenced prisoners to bring about sentencing certainty, that particular issue. Now, helpfully, as has been mentioned, the Minister has this week published his report. I just want to complete my short remarks by just asking a couple of questions about the government response. The government have said in their response, Sir Edward, we are committed to providing long-term prisoners with opportunities for rehabilitation so they can demonstrate they can be released safely back into the community, and we welcome the committee's acknowledgement of our efforts to improve progression. Well, I want to say to the Minister, how many assessments have been made of prisoners and what is the pathway for those prisoners? The Minister has said in his response, we are undertaking and prioritising post-tariff prisoners in accessing rehabilitative interventions, including psychology services, enhanced case management, and for prisoners with complex sets of risks and need. We're also developing progression regimes for prisoners across the country. How many prisoners currently on that 2,400 does that cover? The Minister has also said that we are progressing indeterminate prisoners struggling to achieve release via the usual routes. So my question to the Minister is, with all of those things that he says he's doing in response to the Justice Committee report, at what date does he estimate that the current 2,400 over-tariff IPP prisoners will be in a position to be forwarded to the parole board for assessment? Now, he looks quizzical at that question. The question is simply one that is one he needs to answer, because if he's got an end date, he needs to have an end date and needs to have a programme to get to that end date. He needs to assess those 2,400. He needs to see what courses are needed to be undertaken. He needs to see what the elements of risk are in those 2,400. And he needs to determine whether those 2,400 will reach a threshold for release. Now, we've accepted in our report that within that, there are people who may never be released because they may still pose a threat to society. That is still a time pathway conclusion the Minister and the Department can reach on an individual. So, Sir Edward, my simple plea is this. When? How? And if resentencing is required to give clarity, when will that be brought forward? Because ultimately, the key thing I want from this debate is clarity. And clarity might mean a long time further in prison. It might mean a course to help release somebody in due course. But clarity is needed. And in all of this, Sir Edward, finally, I go back to where I started. We should not forget the victim of the original crime. And there should be some discussion and conclusion as part of this pathway about victim management for those against whom the crimes were originally considered.
Thank you very much, Sir Edward. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair. As always, can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Slough upon obtaining what is a very important debate upon what's a very important subject. And the Minister who is here, and I'm delighted to see in his place, as somebody who has a long and distinguished career at the criminal bar, will know as well as any of us
who have seen this in practice, that this is an unconscionable situation, the result of a well-intended but frank error in policy that was undertaken in the past. That was corrected, but not corrected retrospectively. And hence the position that was found by the High Court and the Supreme Court, that, of course, they could not interfere with sentences which at the time had been lawfully passed, as the then Lord Chief Justice, Lord Thomas, said. But that does not remove the political and actually the moral conundrum which faces us. My honourable friend, the member, Right Honourable Member for Delin, my fellow member of the Select Committee, very fairly points out, and we accept in our Select Committee report, Prison Population 2022, there will indeed be a number, perhaps a significant number, but I suspect not a majority of IP prisoners who are unlikely to be safe to be released in any significant period of time, and perhaps never. I suspect that is a minority, but there will be some. And nobody, I think, has an issue with that, but certainty is important for them, and certainty is important for the victims of those grave crimes to know that that will be the case. Of course I will.
I'm very grateful to the gentleman for his point. Isn't the issue in those circumstances that, properly speaking, those defendants probably ought not to have been sentenced to an IPP in the first place, but a life sentence? Now, if that's the case, isn't the correct thing to do to put that right, rather than continuing with this fiction that they're on an IPP with a tariff which they've long since superseded?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and his experience at the criminal bar leads him to the same conclusion as it leads me. That's precisely the case. Because given that this situation is unacceptable for the reasons that have been highlighted by the Right Honourable Member for Delin and in detail by my honourable friend and fellow Select Committee member, the Honourable Member for Banbury, it is unacceptable that we leave a situation where a number of people are in limbo. One such case was illustrated in our Select Committee report. Evidence from the sister of an IPP prisoner who died after a self-harm incident in prison still, often found himself in prisons that did not offer the specific type of rehabilitation that he needed, no support or guidance on how to move to a prison that offered them. If there was ever a ray of hope with regards to this, it was often lost owing to the lack of feedback on progress, the resource being changed, or even closed down. What that leads me to conclude is this, Sir Edward. First of all, we need to make sure that the prison regime itself does offer proper rehabilitative and therapeutic offender management courses to those who are in a position to benefit from them. That requires a steady and stable regime within the prisons, which is not yet always the case in many institutions. Secondly, it implies a greater degree of monitoring of the specific needs of IPP prisoners to make sure that they are moved to establishments where those are available. Thirdly, it means moving away from the current practice where very often IPP prisoners are not allowed to seek transfer to open institutions, which gives the parole board the difficulty, not having been able to test their behaviour and therefore the risk of reoffending in open conditions, to take the rather difficult, in public perception terms, risk of either keeping them locked up perhaps needlessly or releasing them immediately without having experienced open conditions. All those need to be done. The parole board gave evidence to us that certain mechanisms which are currently available to them could be made more use of, and I would urge the Minister to speak urgently to the chair of the parole board about speeding up the ability, for example, to prevent needless recall for technical reasons has been pointed out by, for example, suspending the period of supervision after 4 years of good behaviour on licence, a specific and I would suggest sensible proposal, and indeed removing the cancellation of the licence after 10 years on licence. In many cases, this will be significantly more than the minimum term they were sentenced for by quite a multiple. Those will be sensible things that could be done. But also, we have, I think, to grasp the nettle, Sir Edward, that, as Lord Thomas of Cumgead rightly said, Parliament needs to grasp the nettle, either make resources available so that proper rehabilitation can take place, or change the test for release That's certainly something that would need to be consulted upon, but it's something we need to set out, because it has been very highly set at the moment, and it's perhaps or change, as my honourable friend, the member for Charlton, says, the statutory provision so that these people can be resentenced under current sentencing practice and procedures to a determinate sentence. In the worst cases, that will no doubt be life. Otherwise, they may be sometimes significant, other times less significant determinate sentences. But then they, their families and the victims of the offences will know precisely what the regime is and precisely what the rules are that relate to that release. This is something that ought not to be too difficult to achieve. I cannot think for one moment that there will be opposition to that in any quarter of this House where the government seek to find a legislative opportunity to bring that forward. And I earnestly urge my honourable and learned friend, the Minister, who I know is a reformer at heart and recognises the need to move these matters on, to make that case as strongly as he can within government, to find the time to take what are the fairly modest steps that would rectify an injustice which is a needless blot upon our system.
Well done.
I can also, first of all, just thank the Honourable Member for Slough for bringing the issue forward, and to other Right Honourable and Honourable Members who have made contributions. I can fully understand the concerns as they've been expressed today. And I am someone who firmly believes in the punishment fitting the crime. And I have long had an issue with the release of sexual predators back into society. Indeed, there was recently an issue with an offender who had a long history of sexual offences in my constituency, who repeatedly was being inappropriate with young children. And the community carried out a citizen's arrest when he was caught in the midst of a lewd act. And as a consequence of running away from a person walking by who witnessed the act, the perpetrator was injured. My point is clear, Sir Edward, is that it would have been better for the offender, who truly seems unable to keep himself under control, and most certainly better for those young girls who have had their innocence stolen and are unable to undo or unsee the acts that he carried out in front of them. I want to give that story at the beginning, Sir Edward, because I agree with the two honourable members and both right honourable members who spoke beforehand, and who said that the punishment must fit the crime, and I very clearly would be of that ilk as well. At the same time, we do recognise the pressures on the prison and the parole systems. I do believe before they can be released, prisoners serving indefinite sentences have to demonstrate that they have addressed their offending behaviour and are no longer a risk to society. In the 21st of June 2011, the day the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Bill was published, the Prime Minister at that time, David Cameron, gave a press conference in which he said, "We are going to review the existing system urgently with a view to replacing it with an alternative that is clear, tough and better understood by the public." So there's been lots of requests for change and lots of indications for change. And indeed, in the 20th of April 2016, the then Justice Secretary, Michael Gove, wrote to the Chair of the Justice Committee about prison reform, and he said that whilst he had no current plans to change the statutory test for releasing prisoners after completion of the TARF, there are initiatives to help IPP prisoners make progress towards release. So there certainly has been much talk about it over the last period of time that I've been in this House, and I suspect maybe long before that as well. I can fully understand the reason that these kinds of sentences were given, but I also understand that our duty of care to the prisoner means we need to have rehabilitation in place to ensure that they can get back into the community if they are fit to get back into the community. I am possibly from a generation who believes that there are consequences for actions, and the consequence of a sexual offence should mean curtailment of freedom, especially for those who seem likely to reoffend. We need to remember that it's not a number on a page or a statistic, but it's children, little boys and girls whose innocence have been stolen, and who will battle with all that loss all of their lives. It is not simply a matter of removing that person from their lives. It is learning to deal with the trauma and trust again. And whilst we can never mete out enough punishment for them to get their lives back, we can prevent other children from having to go through what they went through. So when you commit when the offender commits a sexual offence, he needs to know that his actions or her actions will result in the removal from society until it's deemed safe for you to return to society. And even then, it will not be without changes. No one can do these kind of things and return to their life. It is irrevocably change. So, while I've been honest, I feel probably little or no sympathy for them. My sympathy is reserved for the victims. I believe we must also be able to ensure that those who are likely to offend or present a danger are kept away from the vulnerable and from communities. But do we need to change the system? Yes, we do. And to make it more effective? Undoubtedly. Do we need to provide help and assistance to those who struggle with urge and impulse control? Definitely. Do we need to have a form of rehabilitation that truly prepares the inmate for the real world? Certainly. Are the vulnerable in the community the ones whom we must serve in any decision to release an IPP offender? Absolutely. There must be a bottom line in any change, and I'm sure that the Minister, in response to the contributions from right honourable and honourable members, will consider this with any changes that he suggests may come forward. Thank you.
Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Edward. May I start by congratulating the member for Slough on securing this debate and making a really comprehensive, detailed and powerful argument about the injustices of what are supposedly short-term sentences. We've heard in this debate much agreement on the issue under discussion, so we await solid answers from the government on the action that they will now take on this important issue, because, as my honourable friend, the member for Lewisham Western Penge, pointed out, there are 2,403 prisoners still serving an IPP sentence who were yet to be released as of March this year, 90% of whom have already served the minimum tariff that was handed down by the judge at their trial. We cannot say that enough has been done in the 7 years since this change. As the chair of the Justice Select Committee put it, policy has been corrected but not retrospectively, and that means that thousands of people are still waiting in limbo as their ability to imagine a world outside prison and their chances of rebuilding their lives without reoffending deteriorate. I would like to say how pleased I am that the member for Delyn made the point. It is a point about balance. We should all remember that the people have committed a crime and hurt a victim, in the right honourable member's own words, and the balance is to strike that balance between punishment for that offence and providing a pathway to rehabilitation. The argument against IPP sentencing is clear, and the government does not seem to disagree with us on this simple question of justice. Indefinite custody with no fixed end should only be used for the most serious offences, where the public would genuinely be at risk. We have heard many examples of where this wasn't really the case, and where relatively minor crimes are still being punished disproportionately with what some feel amounts to a life sentence. The Howard League for Penal Reform has said that this cohort of prisoners have particularly difficulties with anxiety, as they saw others who had been convicted of similar crimes after 2008 enter and leave prison while they were detained substantially beyond their tariff date. Where people are safe to be released, we should quite clearly not be keeping them in custody to serve their sentence many times over. It is against all the most basic principles of fairness and justice, and the punishment must fit the crime, a point stressed by the member for Strangford in his speech. Of course.
I'm very grateful with every word she's saying. The punishment must fit the crime. Does she agree with me that the real concern here is that the punishment is not that which the judge handed down in court when he had all the facts before him or her, but increasingly is the preserve of those people within custody who are applying often completely extraneous considerations?
Point well made, and I thank him for that intervention. The impact on those serving IPP sentences and their families is heartbreaking. We have heard of those who have self-harmed and died by suicide in prison. The shocking fact that IPP prisoners are significantly more likely to self-harm, a point that is made by many in this debate. than both determinate sentence prisoners and life sentence prisoners just goes to show the urgency with which the government needs to tackle this issue. As the member for Banbury made clear, they are victims of pretty catastrophic policy making. A study published by the Griffin Society in 2019 examined the impact on women serving IPP sentences. 6 of the 9 women interviewed had tried to commit suicide multiple times during the sentence. 5 of the 9 had had their children taken into care. These are significant risks for the 43 women still serving IPP sentences today and their innocent families. I would love to know what action the government has taken on this. What have they done, for instance, in response to the family of Tommy Nicol, who, as we have heard, died by suicide while serving an IPP sentence? His sister Donna, a point also made in this debate, has called for those serving initial tariffs of 4 years or less to have their sentences converted to fixed sentences. This seems like it could be a common-sense way to tackle the ongoing injustice of IPP prisoners. What is the government's position on this? We can talk about the flaws of the original policy of IPP itself. We all agree on that. But a major reason many prisoners who have served their time are still waiting in limbo is due to the chronic mismanagement of the justice system that this government has presided over. This mismanagement affects everyone involved in our prison system, not just those prisoners with IPP sentences. We have heard about prisoners who have been asked to demonstrate commitment to therapy for mental health issues in order to prove they are fit for release, but have no access to such therapy in the prison they are placed in. This is in part due to the sheer numbers of people on waiting lists for these much-needed courses in our overcrowded prisons. I've urged the government before and will urge them again to take action on the deficit in mental health provision in all parts of society. But when 1 in 3 prisoners has mental health issues, and when the people involved are so often a higher risk to society, surely prison is one area where particular attention is given to mental health provision. Can the Minister tell me what they are doing to make mental health a priority in our prisons? But there are other reasons specific to IPP prisoners that would be far easier to fix. We have heard in this debate about the prisoners who are given access to such important courses based on how close they are to their release date, which in the case of an IPP prisoner is indefinite. If we are serious about rehabilitation, then these prisoners will need more support on their release from prison. When people emerge from prison to a housing market in crisis, low-paid and insecure work is the only option, and a safety net that has been slashed by austerity over the past decade of Tory rule, it is unsurprising that reoffending rates are so abysmal. And although this important issue of IPP sentences is quite rightly the focus of today's discussion, we are speaking about this in the context of a wider justice system that is falling apart. Many prisons are operating at significantly over their certified capacity. This overcrowding is just one factor that has led to the fact that prisons have become substantially more violent in recent years. And the deficit in provision of courses that make recidivism less likely, including training for work and mental health therapy, is in part due to the impossible number of prisoners on the waiting list in any given prison. These problems are especially acute for the IPP prisoners who are the subject of this debate, but actually affects all types of prisoners and with them our broader social fabric. This is what really will put public safety at risk, not releasing prisoners who may well be ready to reintegrate into society, but who are not given a chance to prove it. What is the government doing on this issue of overcrowding, and how many more Tommy Nichols are we likely to lose while we wait for them to take action?
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Edward. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and indeed as a former member of the legal profession yourself, I know you'll have a particular interest in this important issue. And I also congratulate the Honourable Gentleman, the member for Slough, for securing the debate on this important subject. I know he has a long interest in these issues, and we have debated them before in my former capacity as a law officer. It's a pleasure now to be able to address him and other honourable and right honourable members in my capacity as Minister of State for Justice. I think we can all agree, Sir Edward, that the sentence of imprisonment for public protection, the IPP as we know it, has long been a source of great concern. I well remember the introduction of that type of sentence pursuant to the 2003 Criminal Justice Act coming into force in about 2005, and initially it was used quite often. It was used for a range of offences, for which the sentence was applicable, sentences involving assault, serious assault, sentences involving threats to kill, a range of offences that we've heard about today, such as arson and other types of offence, which of course are serious, but for which the full consequences in terms of these sentences, I don't think, could have been envisaged by the courts at that time. And indeed, there was Court of Appeal Authority, the case of Lang, which importantly limited the ways in which IPP sentences could be used. That had an immediate effect upon the range of use of that sentence. And indeed, there was legislative change in 2008 after another Court of Appeal case which raised serious concerns about the ability of the system to cope with this cohort of prisoners. And then, quite rightly, in 2012, the sentence itself was abolished by this government under the Legal Aid Punishment and Sentencing Act of that year. Now, it's right to say that the IPP population consisted of many, frankly, dangerous offenders who had very often committed serious and violent and sexual offences. And there was evidence, because that was before the courts at the time, of troubling escalations of behaviour prior to that offending that led to an IPP sentence. And I think it's important to look at the policy that underlay the imposition of that regime. And it was twofold. It was for the punishment of offenders, but also there was a specific public protection function that was introduced. That was part of the underlying policy by the then Labour government, that for the very first time enjoined sentences to look at future risk, which was something that was unprecedented, something that hadn't ever been quite approached in that way, but something that had a clearly delineated function that was to be exercised in the form of a determination of dangerousness. And therefore, what judges were asked to do was to make a decision based upon information and evidence before them, either in the form of a pre-sentence report or a psychiatric assessment, or the serious nature of the offence itself, which could have allowed them to determine whether or not an offender was dangerous for the purposes of the Act and dangerous enough to merit an IPP. That was the law at the time, that was the policy at the time. We rightly now look back upon it with concern. We look upon it with the wisdom of 15 years of experience and realise that it has led to some of the cases that we have heard about today, and indeed many others that we will have had in our constituency casework. But that was the reality of the situation facing the courts then. And whilst I hear very strongly the view that is expressed by many honourable and right honourable members about the possibility of changing the law to, in effect, re-sentence these offenders, we do have to take some care about that. Now, it could be done. I'm not saying that there is no immutable bar to passing legislation that would have, in effect, a retrospective effect. But there is, I think, a sensitivity here in terms of cutting across the original sentencing exercise and the finding of the court. It will be difficult, I think, for a fresh sentencer to put themselves entirely in the position of the sentencing judge at the time of the offence, and that is why I hesitate before I accept the strong views that are put by honourable members. And I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to the Minister, who of course is making an entirely fair point, but he began his remarks by acknowledging that there are people in custody who have served a period of time which is far beyond what that original sentencing judge anticipated. My constituent has served 13 years after an IPP with a 4-year tariff. I recognise that there are difficulties with resentencing, but shouldn't we all be very concerned in circumstances where people are in custody for far longer than the original sentencing judge ever had in mind?
Yeah, well, look, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, who, of course, brings his own considerable experience of criminal practice and having dealt with many cases of great seriousness. And he's right to draw to my attention the specific case of his constituent. There are other ways that I think that we can deal with this problem, and I will outline them to the House as I develop my remarks. Indeed, I hope to specifically answer the queries that have properly been raised by honourable and right honourable members. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way before he moves on to that point. But can I just supplement the intervention from my honourable friend? And that's this. Of course, the Minister refers to the difficulty of putting oneself in the position of the sentencing judge. But the reality is that no one is likely to have been better placed to understand those difficulties than the former Lord Chief Justice when he made his observations in the course of a judgment in the Court of Appeal. And that we all know that there are circumstances, for example, when a sentence is reviewed for other reasons, that the court will, for reasons of good public policy, nonetheless embark upon that difficult exercise. So whilst it is an issue which has to be borne in mind, there is precedent for demonstrating that it is not an insuperable obstacle.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend to this extent that, of course, in the appellate procedure there will often be that check and balance that can be done. But this is slightly different. This would be a change in the law, a change in the legal framework to alter the position from that applied when the offender was sentenced to the position now. That is a departure. Whether we like it or not, that is a departure, and it's something that we need to be very careful about in terms of either avoiding setting inadvertent precedents or actually fully being able to reflect the assessment of risk that was made by the learned judge at the time of sentence. In other words, how does a court now properly assess the length of a determinate sentence, which presumably would be the aim of honourable and right honourable members, or whether or not it takes the further step of imposing a life sentence, which might be appropriate in some very serious cases. Now, I don't pretend that these are easy issues, but at the same time, I don't pretend that this is a matter for me or for the government to do nothing, which is why I think there are other measures that we are taking that are already yielding very significant results, not just in reducing the number of prisoners who are held under this regime, but also making sure that more eligible prisoners can indeed be considered as quickly as possible. Can I just deal with another point that my honourable friend, the member for Bromley and chair of the Justice Select Committee, made about the remarks of the Lord Chief Justice, as he then was, Lord Thomas of Cwmgyrdd, who talked not just about change in the statutory provision, but also changing the test for release, which I think is a very important point to be considered. In considering that, I think he would concede with me that the test for release in terms of prisoners held on this sort of regime needs to be as consistent as possible, bearing in mind there are different classes of prisoners who are held in custody or either on minimum terms or subject to parole, and that we must take great care in not creating too many different tests, which means that one group of prisoners is perhaps treated in a different and potentially more favourable way than another. I'm not saying that the argument doesn't have merit. I am just putting the other point of view that there are difficulties in creating what could be potential inconsistencies. I think it's my job, it behoves, and it is beholden upon me as a lawyer now in this position of great responsibility to try to make sure that the sort of unforeseen consequences that this policy making occurred do not repeat themselves by any change that we may make. Now, I want to develop the points I'm going to make, Sir Edward, about the way in which we can best support prisoners to show that they can safely be released. That's the solution, I think, that stares us in the face for so many people in this position. Now, of course, and the Honourable Lady, the member for Ashfield, the opposition spokesman, made that point very well. The necessity of ensuring public protection from violent and sexual crime has to be paramount. But our continuing efforts, as I was alluding to earlier, to rehabilitate prisoners subject to this regime are bearing fruit. We have seen a dramatic fall in the IPP prison population in the last several years, and the figures that have been cited by, amongst others, the Honourable Lady, the member for Lewisham West and and Penge are absolutely right. It is a dramatic fall. It's still a significant cohort, I accept. And there, of course, are another number of IPP prisoners who've been recalled, who we mustn't forget, and I'll come to that in a moment. But it is right to say that the progress that is being made is going in the right direction. And back in January of 2016, over 3 years ago, a joint HM Prison and Probation Service and Parole Board action plan was drawn up to deal with IPPs. Now, initially, that was primarily focused on improving the efficiency of the parole process, since at that time there was still a significant backlog in listing oral hearings for IPP and life sentence prisoners. As a result of receiving additional resources and as a result of changing some of its processes, the Parole Board and indeed the Public Protection Casework section in the Ministry of Justice made progress, and the combined effect was to eliminate that backlog. Now, simply having a more efficient system, Sir Edward, resulted in a significant improvement to the pace by which IPP prisoners were being released. And following those improvements, the plan was then expanded to include a much greater focus on those prisoners who, even with a much more efficient parole system, needed that additional support in order to reduce their own risk and so to secure a release decision from the board. Well, what was done? Well, first of all, there was a central case file review, and that was done by senior psychologists of those IPP prisoners who had not made the progress that had been anticipated. And that has achieved considerable success. Out of 1,365 reviews completed, 233 prisoners in these most challenging cases have achieved release, with a further 401 achieving a progressive move to open conditions. And we've put in place enhanced case management for the most complex cases so that a multidisciplinary team works together to remove those barriers to progression. And the joint IPP action plan has also overseen further improvements to that process. But perhaps most significantly, we've opened 3 new progression regimes, alluding to the point made by my honourable friend. We're building on the success and the outstanding reputation of the first such regime that was established at Warren Hill. Now, these sites operate a staged regime of increasing freedom and responsibility, allowing evidence to build on offenders' ability to manage their own risks. The rate of release from a progression regime is higher than the average release rate across all parole board hearings, and I think that is something that all members will welcome. Now, as comprehensive as this plan and the opportunities it provides to IPP prisoners is, the decision actively to engage with efforts which promote rehabilitation and so demonstrate that they can be safely released back into the community has to be ultimately for each prisoner. But that's why the HMPPS change programme is now in delivering a new offender management model is, in my view, fundamental, Sir Edward. Not only for IPP prisoners, but for all prisoners. With increased staffing and the introduction of the key worker role in all prisons, staff will be better equipped and given more time to work with individuals who may not be engaging in the way that they need to do in order to reduce their risk. We're aware, Sir Edward, that some prisoners may well have become demoralised, with no fixed date of release, and with the prospect of a further parole hearing currently not frankly holding much hope for them. But here, the key worker will need to get alongside the prisoner and build hope from the foundation of a strong relationship, encouraging that prisoner to grasp the opportunities that will be available to them. And the government, and I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. It's not an unreasonable point to ask the question, at what stage will that process be completed for the prisoners who are currently serving IPP sentences?
He asked the point again, and I take it fairly and squarely. I think, first of all, the answer has to be, it is a case-by-case basis, because each prisoner will have they've all got an individual story, an individual set of needs that I think does not merit a one-size-fits-all approach. Frankly, the cohort that we're now dealing with, frankly, will probably be the tougher end of the spectrum. There will be, and I think he conceded this quite properly, a cohort of IPP prisoners who may never be released because of the seriousness of the offences and indeed the risk that they still pose. And I know he accepts that. And therefore, I can't give him a figure or a timescale, but what I can say is that the work that is going on here has shown a vast increase in the pace by which we've achieved release and achieved resolution. And the model that we're now adopting, I believe, will lead to even greater engagement. And of course, he can hold me to account as the months go by. And if there is no progress, then he quite rightly will ask me the questions, and I independently will ask the questions of civil servants as to why it is that the initial progress that we made perhaps hasn't been maintained. And quite rightly, as a member of the committee, he will hold me to account for that. I just want to deal with some more of the figures that we were looking at. And rightly, we've heard about the overall unreleased IPP population. About 200 of that 2,400 cohort have yet to serve their minimum tariff, Sir Edward. And as I was saying, we've made progress in reducing it. In fact, during the year 2017-2018, the parole board progressed to open conditions or actually released around 3 out of every 4 IPP prisoners who appeared before it. As I was saying, the cohort becomes increasingly challenging, and that will require increasingly intensive rehabilitation. Now, rehabilitating and assessing the risk presented by these prisoners, many of whom, sadly, have committed very serious sexual offences against children, is particularly challenging. The Honourable Gentleman for Strangford opened his remarks by referring to that sort of horrendous offence and the need for public protection. It should be acknowledged that some IPP prisoners may never be released, as I was saying, because, frankly, the risk they pose is just too great for safe management in the community. But that, of course, allows me to go on to the issue of mental health and self-harm. And we are working to reduce the incidence of self-harm amongst IPP prisoners as part of our prison safety programme. And here again, the key worker role that I referred to, Sir Edward, will perform a vital role. And additionally, HMPPS is improving the process for people at risk of suicide or self-harm. We've improved prevention training for nearly 25,000 prison staff, and we've refreshed our partnership with the Samaritans for a period of 3 years with £1.5 million in funding, supporting the excellent Listeners scheme through which prisoners are trained to provide support for their very fellow prisoners. That peer-to-peer support that we all know works in so many settings. And working to address broader mental health issues in the IPP population remains very important. Since April of last year, we have a new national partnership agreement for prison health, and mental health services are available in all prisons. And just to turn for a moment to the issue of women IPP prisoners that has been raised, they, I'm glad to say, have a dedicated senior psychologist who is providing a specific progression pathway and also support from a multidisciplinary team to deal with some of the challenges that those prisoners are facing with regard to mental health. Now, the commissioning of mental health services by NHS partners is based on a local assessment of health needs, and they are then provided to prisoners on the basis of individual need. And when you think about it, that has to be right, because the one-size-fits-all approach, again, does not work, as we know, when it comes to mental health. Assessments are carried out by independently professionally trained clinicians, and no one is refused access where there is an assessed need. We're well aware that many of those serving IPP sentences experience mental health difficulties, and part of the action plan aims to ensure that there is access to appropriate treatment. Now, one example that I mentioned earlier is the case file reviews that was carried out by senior psychologists. Alongside those who have been released or moved to open conditions, 54 of that cohort who were reviewed have been transferred to secure hospitals, where, of course, they can then receive the best treatment for their needs. Can I deal with the issue of recalls, which has properly been raised, Sir Edward? First of all, with regard to the test, I think it's important for me to reiterate that the test of recall is quite a stringent one. when it comes to IPP offenders, because they can only be recalled where their behaviour and the nature of the licence breach indicates a causal link to their original offending, and that the public is at risk of further serious or violent or sexual offending. So that's quite a different and, frankly, a more stringent test for recall than would exist elsewhere in the system. But work is being done to make sure that recall is properly focused, where it is only necessary to protect the public. And efforts are being made to keep offenders on licence in the community wherever possible. And that includes the creation of new guidance to probation officers on licence variations and alternatives to recall. And also guidance about best practice at the management of offenders on licence to improve their compliance and to stop the risk from escalating. And a new power to release IPP prisoners on the papers is being used for those on recall. The Parole Board have introduced a quicker 48-hour turnaround time to consider licence variation requests from probation to support continued management on licence in the community. So we are looking and investigating the rise in the number of IPP prisoners on recall to see how that rate can be safely reduced and to, again, cite the Honourable Lady, to get that balance right between the need to protect the public and the need to rehabilitate offenders. A number of cases were raised with me, Sir Edward. I agree that the case of Wayne Bell, is a very concerning one. And I understand that he is now receiving treatment for his mental health issues in an appropriate setting, which is welcome. The troubling case of Tommy Nicol was raised quite popularly, and my predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Penrith and the Border, met with Donna Mooney, the sister of Mr Nicol, earlier this year, and we remain in contact with her at an official, and I very much hope, although I'm a new minister, at a ministerial level. And we have another meeting planned with her in the autumn. It is a particularly tragic case, but I can assure Honourable and Right Honourable members that we will continue to work with her to address the concerns that she raises with such dignity and such clarity. The Honourable